The snow fell slowly outside the castle window. It was the middle of winter, and the forest beyond the walls was silent and gray. A queen sat by the window, sewing. Her fingers moved carefully over the dark wooden frame, and she watched the white flakes fall softly to the ground below. Then the needle slipped. A small drop of red blood fell from her finger. It landed on the white snow on the windowsill. The queen looked at the three colors: the black of the wooden frame, the white of the snow, the red of her blood. She said quietly to herself, "I wish for a child, with lips as red as blood, skin as white as snow, and hair as black as this wood." She had her wish. Before the winter was over, she gave birth to a baby girl. The child's lips were red as blood. Her skin was white as snow. Her hair was black as the darkest wood. The queen named her Snow White. But the queen grew sick soon after. She lay in her cold bed with the fire burning low, and she held the baby one last time. Her hands were thin and pale. Then she closed her eyes and did not open them again. Snow White grew up inside the castle walls. She was a quiet child, with dark eyes and a soft voice. She liked to sit near the window where her mother had sat. She watched the birds in the bare winter trees. She listened to the wind. When Snow White was 7 years old, her father, the king, married again. The new queen was tall and beautiful. She had long red hair and cold green eyes. She wore dresses of deep blue and dark green, and she walked through the rooms of the castle as if she owned everything she could see. The servants stepped back when she passed. The king smiled at her and gave her whatever she asked for. The new queen had a mirror. It was not an ordinary mirror. It hung on the wall of her private room, framed in gold, and when she spoke to it, it answered. The queen spoke to it every morning. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror always gave the same answer. "You, my queen, are the fairest in the land." The queen smiled at this. She put on her rings and went about her day. Snow White grew taller. She became a young woman, quiet and gentle, with her mother's black hair and pale skin and red lips. She did not know about the mirror. She did not know that she was beautiful. She simply lived her days, walking in the castle gardens, feeding the birds from her hand, humming small songs to herself in the cold morning air. Then one day, when Snow White was 14 years old, the mirror said something different. The queen stood before it in the early morning light, her red hair loose around her shoulders, and she asked her usual question. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" There was a pause. The surface of the mirror shimmered like still water when a stone falls into it. "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White is now fairer than you." The queen went very still. The room felt colder. She looked at herself in the mirror, her fine cheekbones, her green eyes, the smooth skin she worked so hard to keep young and perfect. Then she thought of Snow White, that quiet girl with her black hair and her calm, dark eyes. The queen's hands closed into fists at her sides. She stood there for a long time, alone in her cold room, while the castle woke up around her. From that morning, something changed. The queen began to look at Snow White differently. When Snow White entered a room, the queen watched her from across the space with eyes that were sharp and still. When Snow White smiled, the queen turned away. When Snow White laughed, a rare, soft sound. The queen pressed her lips together and left. Envy grew in the queen's heart like a weed growing between stones. It pushed through slowly, but it pushed through completely. She could not be second. She could not stand to be less than anything. And she could not stand for a 14-year-old girl, a child, to be more beautiful than her in her own kingdom. She made a plan. She called for a huntsman. He was a big man with a brown beard and large hands, and he stood in the queen's room with his head slightly bowed. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Somewhere outside, a bird called twice and went silent. "Take the girl into the forest," the queen said. Her voice was quiet and clear. "Take her far in, where no one will find her. Kill her, and bring me back her heart in this box." She understood something was very wrong, but she did not ask questions. She turned and ran between the trees until he could not see her anymore. The huntsman stood up slowly. He cleaned his knife on the grass. Then he went and found a young deer in the forest, and he killed it. He put its heart in the small wooden box. He brought the box back to the queen. She opened it and looked at the heart inside. She smiled, a slow, cold smile. She closed the box and set it aside. "Good," she said. She believed she was free. Snow White ran until her lungs burned. She ran until the light through the trees changed from gold to gray, and then to the dark blue of evening. Branches scratched her arms. Roots caught her feet. She fell twice, and each time she got up and kept running. When she finally stopped, she was deep in the forest, deeper than she had ever been. She could hear water somewhere nearby. An owl called once, then went silent. She was shaking. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. She did not know which direction the castle was, and she did not want to know. She kept walking, more slowly now, following a small path between the trees. The path was faint, like something animals used, but it was still a path. Then she saw a light. It was small and yellow, and it came from a low window between the trees. As she got closer, she saw a little house, very small, with a low door and a thatched roof and a tiny garden of vegetables at the side. Everything about the house was small, as if it had been built for children. She knocked on the door. No answer came. She knocked again. Nothing. She pushed the door, and it opened. Inside, the house was clean and neat and smelled of wood smoke and something warm. Soup, maybe, or bread from earlier in the day. There was a long table with 7 small plates, 7 small cups, and 7 small spoons. Against one wall, there were 7 small beds, each with a white pillow and a dark wool blanket. Snow White was very hungry and very tired. She ate a little food from each plate, just a small bite, so that no single plate was empty. She drank a sip from each cup. Then she looked at the beds. She was too tall for one bed on its own, so she lay down across 3 of them, sideways, with her arms at her sides and her hair spread dark against the white pillows. She fell asleep almost immediately. The owners of the house came home an hour later. They were 7 men, very short, with wide shoulders and strong hands from years of work in the mountains. Every day they went into the mines in the hills above the forest, and every evening they came home carrying their tools. Small pickaxes, leather bags, candles burned down to stumps. Their boots were always gray with rock dust. When they came through the door, they stopped and looked around. "Someone has eaten from my plate," said the first. "And from mine," said the second. "Someone has been drinking from my cup," said the third. They went around the table, each one noticing something slightly different. Then the 7th man looked toward the beds and went very still. "Come here," he said quietly to the others. They came and stood around the 3 beds. Snow White was sleeping on her back, her black hair around her, her red lips slightly parted. She breathed slowly and quietly. The 7 men looked at her for a long time without speaking. They decided not to wake her. In the morning, when Snow White opened her eyes and found 7 small faces looking down at her, she was frightened. She sat up quickly, but the men's faces were not frightening. They were curious and a little amused, like people who have found something unexpected in a familiar place. "Who are you?" asked the tallest of them, though he was not very tall at all. She told them her name. She told them everything: the queen, the huntsman, the knife, the forest. The men listened carefully. When she finished, the one who had spoken first said, "Stay with us. You can keep the house clean and cook the meals, and in return you can sleep here and be safe. But do not open the door to anyone while we are at work. The queen has a magic mirror. She will find out you are alive." Snow White agreed. And so she began her new life in the small house among the trees. She swept the floors in the morning and aired the blankets in the thin winter sunlight. She learned where the 7 men kept their things and what each one liked to eat. They never told her their names, and she never asked. She simply called them, in her head, by the things she noticed. The quiet one, the careful one, the one who hummed while he worked, the one who laughed at everything. They were good company. The house felt safe. But the queen, far away in the castle, went to her mirror that morning. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most beautiful of all?" The mirror was silent for a moment. Then it said, "You are beautiful, my queen. It is true. But Snow White, deep in the forest, beyond 7 mountains, is 1,000 times more beautiful than you. She lives with 7 miners in a house among the trees, and she is still alive." The queen went very cold. She understood at once. The huntsman had lied. The heart in the box was not Snow White's heart. She sat down in her chair and said nothing for a long time. The room was so quiet that she could hear the wind against the stone walls outside. Then she stood up. She went to a small chest in the corner of the room and she opened it. She began to plan. The queen was clever. She knew that if she sent another servant to find Snow White, that servant might fail as well, might feel pity, might turn back. She decided that this time she would go herself. She was good at disguise. She had learned this skill when she was young, and she had never forgotten it. She dressed as an old woman, a traveling merchant, with a gray cloak and a bent back and a large basket on her arm. She stained her hands with walnut juice to make them look old and brown. She changed her voice to a slow, creaking sound, like an old door. When she looked in the mirror, not her magic mirror, just an ordinary one, she did not recognize herself. She walked through the forest for a long time. She followed the path to the small house. She knocked at the door. Snow White had been warned. She did not plan to open the door. She called out, "I cannot open the door. The men of the house told me not to." "That is all right, my dear," said the old woman's cracked voice. "Just look through the window. I only want to show you something." Snow White came to the window and looked out. The old woman was holding up something long and bright, a lace bodice cord, red and gold. Beautiful. It was the kind of thing that young women used to tie the front of their dresses tightly at the waist. "Pretty, isn't it?" said the old woman. "Let me tie it for you. Just open the window a little." Snow White opened the window a little. She was too young and not cautious enough, and the cord was beautiful. The old woman's hands were quick. She put the cord around Snow White's waist and pulled it tighter, tighter, so tight that Snow White could not breathe. Her lungs stopped. Her vision went dark. She fell to the floor of the small house like a candle being blown out. "Now you are the most beautiful," the old woman whispered, and left. That evening, the 7 miners came home and found Snow White lying on the floor, not moving, her face pale and still. The tallest one knelt down beside her and felt the cord at her waist. "This," he said. He cut the cord with his penknife. Air rushed back into Snow White's lungs. Her eyes opened. Her color came back. She coughed twice, then sat up slowly. They told her again, "Open the door to no one. Trust no one. Not even someone who looks kind and harmless and old." Snow White promised. She truly meant it. The queen came home and went to her mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most beautiful of all?" "Snow White is still alive," said the mirror calmly, "in the house among the trees beyond 7 mountains. She is 1,000 times more beautiful than you." The queen did not shout. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together and went back to her chest in the corner. The second time, she came as a different kind of merchant. Her basket held a beautiful comb, silver and black, carved with tiny flowers. She had painted the teeth of the comb with a clear poison that dried without smell or color, invisible as water. She knocked at the door of the small house. Snow White did not open it, but she came to the window. "Just a comb," said the old woman. "A gift. No payment. You have such lovely black hair. It deserves a beautiful comb. Look, I will simply pass it through the window." She held it up. It was truly beautiful. The silver caught the light. The carved flowers looked real. Snow White took it. She ran the comb once through her black hair. She fell immediately, right there at the window, not even making a sound. That evening, the miners found her again. The tallest one looked at her hair and found the comb. He pulled it out carefully. Snow White opened her eyes. This time her face was very serious when she looked at the 7 men. "I know," she said before they could speak. "I know I should not have taken it. I know." "The queen will try again," said the quiet one. "She will not stop." And he was right. The queen's third attempt was different. She did not hurry. She spent 3 days preparing. She took an apple, a large, beautiful apple, half red and half pale gold, and she pushed poison deep into the red side with a needle, filling the flesh with a liquid that had no taste and no smell. The gold side she left untouched. She cut a small piece from the gold side and ate it herself in front of the mirror. Nothing happened. The poison was only on the red side. This time, she came dressed as a farmer's wife, rosy cheeks, warm voice, a broad smile, a basket of fruit on her arm. She knocked at the door of the small house. Snow White did not move from her chair. "I cannot open the door," she called out. "I cannot take anything from the window either. Please, go away." "Of course," said the farmer's wife cheerfully. "I understand completely. You are a careful girl. But I have too many apples and I only want to leave you one. I am not selling anything. I only want to give. Here." She held the apple up to the window. "Look how beautiful it is. Look at the color." Snow White looked at it through the glass. It was beautiful. Deep red on one side, warm gold on the other, shining as if it had been polished. "I cannot take it," she said. "Then I will eat half myself," said the farmer's wife, "and you can see that it is safe." She bit into the gold side, the unpoisoned side, and chewed slowly, smiling. "Delicious," she said. "The sweetest apple I have grown this year." Snow White watched her eat. The woman looked perfectly well. The apple looked perfectly safe. And Snow White was hungry, and the apple was beautiful, and she was tired of being afraid. She opened the window. She took the red half of the apple. She bit into it. The sweetness hit her tongue for just one moment. Then something colder than cold moved through her body, from her lips, down, through her chest, and into her arms and legs. And she fell. This time, she did not wake up when the miners came home. The tallest one knelt beside her. He searched her hair for a comb. He searched her waist for a cord. He found nothing. They tried everything they could think of. They checked her breathing. They loosened her clothes. They called her name. Nothing worked. She lay very still on the floor of the small house, her black hair around her lips still red, her skin still white as the snow outside, as white as the cloth her mother had sewn at the window long ago in winter. She looked exactly as if she were sleeping. She did not look dead, but she did not wake. The queen went home and stood before her mirror. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most beautiful of all? The mirror looked at her for a moment. "You are the most beautiful in all the land," it said. The queen stood very still. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a person who has finally finished a long and difficult piece of work. She walked to the window of her room and looked out at the dark forest in the distance. "Good," she said, to no one. And for the first time in many years, she felt satisfied. The 7 miners carried Snow White's body carefully, as if she were sleeping. They laid her on the table in the small house and sat around her all night, waiting. They took turns watching in case she woke. She did not wake. In the morning, when the thin winter light came through the windows, the one who hummed while he worked said quietly, "She is not rotting." They all looked. It was true. Snow White looked exactly as she had looked the evening before, her skin warm-colored, her lips red, her cheeks faintly pink. She looked alive. Only the absolute stillness of her chest, the complete absence of breath, said otherwise. "She should be buried in the ground," said one of the men. "No," said another. "Look at her. She looks like she is only sleeping." They argued quietly for a while. It was the kind of argument that nobody really wins, because nobody really knows the answer. In the end, they made a coffin of glass. They worked on it together for 2 days, carefully and patiently, cutting and fitting the pieces. It was perfectly clear and smooth. And when they laid Snow White inside, you could see every detail of her face. Her black lashes against her white cheeks, the small curve of her red lips. They carried the glass coffin up to a high place on the hill above the forest, where the trees were not so thick and you could see the sky in all directions. They placed it on flat rocks in a clearing. They took turns standing guard beside it, one man always present, day and night. They made a sign and placed it at the head of the coffin. The sign said, "Here lies a princess. She sleeps and cannot be woken." Months passed, then a year. The seasons changed around her. Snow fell on the glass coffin in winter and melted in spring. Flowers grew up around the flat rocks in summer. Leaves turned gold and red and fell in autumn, and lay on top of the glass like a covering. Snow White did not change. She lay in the coffin and looked exactly as she had looked on the night she fell. Her lips red, her hair black, her skin white as winter, as white as the cloth her mother had once sewn beside a window a long time ago. Animals came to the clearing sometimes. An old raven sat on a branch above the coffin for several weeks during one winter. Deer walked through and stopped and looked. The forest accepted the glass coffin and the small still figure inside it as part of itself, the way a forest accepts everything, without question, without judgment. One afternoon in early spring, a young man rode through the forest on a dark horse. He was the prince of a neighboring kingdom, and he had been riding for 3 days without much purpose, following paths when he found them, looking at the land, thinking. He found the path to the clearing by accident, following the sound of water over stones. When he reached the clearing and saw the glass coffin on the flat rocks, he stopped his horse and sat very still for a long moment. Then he dismounted and walked forward slowly. He looked at Snow White through the glass. He read the sign. He stood there for a long time while the wind moved through the trees above him. He went back to the 7 miners' house. He had passed it on the way, and knocked at the door. The miners opened the door and looked up at him. "The woman in the glass coffin," he said. "I would like to take her with me. I will keep her safe. I will treat her with honor. I cannot explain it clearly, but I cannot leave her here." The 7 miners looked at each other. They had been watching Snow White for more than a year. They were tired and they were sad, and they had never found a solution. They talked quietly among themselves for a while. "All right," said the tallest one. "Take her. But be careful with the coffin." The prince and his horse could not carry the coffin alone, so the miners helped. Together they lifted the glass coffin and carried it carefully down the hill and toward the path that led out of the forest. They were walking carefully, stepping slowly, when one of the miners at the back caught his boot on a tree root and stumbled. The coffin tilted. Snow White moved inside. The piece of poisoned apple in her throat, the small piece she had swallowed before she fell, shifted. It came loose. She swallowed once. Color came back into her face in a rush, like a lamp being lit. Her chest moved. She breathed. Her eyes opened. She looked up through the glass at the sky above the trees, at the thin blue of early spring. Then she knocked on the glass. The men set the coffin down quickly. The prince stepped forward and opened the lid. Cold air touched Snow White's face. She sat up and looked around. "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice was rough from long silence. "Still in the forest," said the tallest miner, "but safe. You are safe." She looked at the miners' wide, careful faces. Her eyes were wet, though she did not cry. "I remember," she said. "The apple?" "Yes," said the tallest miner. "The apple. Is she—" Snow White stopped. "Is the queen—" "She is still at the castle," said one of the other men. "The mirror still speaks to her." Snow White was quiet for a moment. The spring wind moved her black hair. She looked at the prince, really looked at him clearly for the first time. "Who are you?" she asked. He told her. She nodded slowly, as if that made sense, though she could not have said exactly why. "I was going nowhere in particular," he said. "I think perhaps I was going here." A small silence passed between them. "I have nowhere to go," said Snow White. "The castle is not safe for me." "Come to my kingdom," said the prince. "You will be a guest. Nothing more. You will be safe and free, and you can decide what you want to do." Snow White looked at the 7 miners. The tallest one nodded slightly, a very small nod, but clear. She looked at the forest around her, at the trees she had walked under for more than a year, at the rocks where the glass coffin had stood. "All right," she said. She stood up, slowly, holding the edge of the coffin, testing her legs. They held. She stepped out onto the ground of the forest, onto the dead leaves and new grass of early spring, and she stood in the open air for the first time in more than a year. Snow White traveled with the prince for 3 days. The road took them through low hills and across a wide river, and then into a valley where a different castle stood, broader than her father's castle, with warm, yellow stone walls, and a garden that smelled of herbs even in early spring. She slept in a quiet room with a window that looked over the garden. She ate warm food. She talked with the prince's household and found them kind and easy, without the cold tension she remembered from her childhood home. Slowly, over days and then weeks, some of the stillness of the glass coffin left her body, and she began to feel like herself again, whatever that meant, after everything that had happened. She and the prince talked often. He was not a complicated man. He liked horses and long rides through the countryside and honest conversation. She was not a complicated woman. She liked gardens and useful work and people who meant what they said. Months passed. They became familiar with each other in the quiet, honest way that people do when they have both survived difficult things. One evening, walking in the garden after dinner, the prince asked her to marry him. She was quiet for a moment. The garden smelled of rosemary and damp earth. A light rain was beginning to fall. "Yes," she said. The wedding was planned for midsummer. Invitations went out across the region, as was the custom, to kings and queens and nobles from all the surrounding kingdoms. No names were left off the list. Everyone was invited. The queen, in her distant castle, received the invitation. She went to her mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most beautiful of all?" The mirror was quiet for just a moment she had stopped noticing over the past year and more. "You are beautiful, my queen. It is true. But the young bride at the summer wedding is 1,000 times more beautiful than you." The queen stared at the mirror. "What bride?" she said. "Where?" The mirror gave her the name of the kingdom. She looked at the invitation on her table. She looked back at the mirror. Her face went cold and white and hard. She dressed for travel without speaking to anyone. She told her household she was attending a wedding in the neighboring kingdom. She chose a beautiful gown, deep blue, with silver thread, and she wore her hair pinned high and her best jewels at her throat. She traveled through the night and arrived at the wedding castle on the morning of the wedding day. She did not know. She had not thought to ask the mirror, and the mirror had not told her who the bride was. She arrived in the great hall with the other guests, and she looked toward the front of the room where the bride and groom stood waiting. The bride was wearing white, with a wreath of dark flowers in her black hair, and her lips were red, and her skin was white, and she was looking forward with clear, calm eyes. The queen stopped walking. The hall was full of noise, music and talking, and the sound of people finding their seats. But for the queen, everything went very quiet. A slow, horrible understanding moved through her, from her throat to her stomach. Snow White was alive. Snow White was the bride. Snow White turned and looked at her. Their eyes met across the room. Snow White did not look away. Her expression was not triumphant. It was simply clear, like a person who has made peace with something difficult. She looked at the queen the way you look at something you understand fully and cannot change. The queen turned to leave. She found that she could not. The guards at the doors were already moving, quietly and quickly, positioning themselves. Someone had recognized her. One of the miners, perhaps, who had been invited to the wedding and who stood near the back of the hall with his brothers, watching with their wide, careful faces. She was surrounded, calmly and without drama. Snow White came forward. "I know what you did," Snow White said. Her voice was not raised, it was very steady. "The cord, the comb, the apple. I know." The queen said nothing. Her beautiful face was completely still, like the surface of a frozen river. "The punishment," said one of the wedding guests, an old nobleman who knew the law of the kingdom, "for an attempted killing of a royal child is to be determined by the one who was harmed." Everyone in the hall was quiet. The music had stopped. Even the candles seemed to steady themselves. Snow White stood for a moment. Her wreath of dark flowers was perfectly still in her black hair. She looked at the queen, at the beautiful face, the gray eyes, the tight, controlled expression. "Bring the shoes," said Snow White. They had been prepared. Not because Snow White had known the queen would come. She had not been certain, but she had thought about it. In the long winter months, in the quiet garden, in the early mornings before the rest of the castle woke. She had thought about what justice looked like. The shoes were made of iron. They had been placed in the fire since early morning, and when they were brought into the hall, they glowed. A deep, throbbing orange red, the color of embers, throwing heat into the cool air around them. They were beautiful in a terrible way, like many things that cause harm. The queen looked at them. "Dance," said Snow White. "Dance in them." The queen could not refuse. She could not run. The guards were at every door, calm and patient. The hall was full of witnesses. She stepped into the shoes. She danced. It did not last long. It could not. When it was over, the queen lay on the floor of the great hall, and she did not get up again. The guests were very quiet. The candles burned. The smell of hot iron stayed in the air for a long time after the shoes were taken away. Snow White stood still at the front of the hall for a moment, looking at the floor. Her expression was difficult to read. Not satisfied, not sad. Somewhere between the two, in a place that does not have a simple name. Then the prince came and stood beside her. He did not speak, but he put his hand on her arm, lightly, the way a person does when they want to say, "I am here, and we can keep going." She took a slow breath. She turned back toward the altar. "Let's continue," she said. And they did. The wedding was long, and the food was good, and the 7 miners ate and drank at the end of one long table, not saying much, watching everything with their wide, quiet faces. The one who hummed while he worked, hummed a little tune under his breath throughout the meal. The one who laughed at everything, laughed when the prince spilled wine on his wedding clothes. Snow White ate and talked and laughed too, when there was something to laugh at. She danced with the prince, who was not a particularly good dancer, but who moved with honest effort, which she found she liked more than skill. The candles burned down through the evening. Outside, the midsummer sky took a long time to go dark, a slow, deep blue that lasted and lasted, as if the day did not want to end. Snow White went to the window at one point, very late, when the hall had grown quieter and some of the guests were beginning to leave. She stood and looked out at the dark garden, at the last thin line of light at the edge of the sky. She thought about the mirror in the queen's distant castle, hanging in its dark room, waiting for the next morning's question. The question that would never come now. She thought about her mother at a winter window, long ago, watching snow fall. 3 drops of blood on a white ledge. A wish spoken quietly to no one. She thought about the forest, the glass coffin, the long, still, silent year. She thought, I am still here. It was not a complicated thought. It was not triumphant. It was simply true, the way some true things are, simple and solid and real, like the stone wall under her hand, cold from the night air, firm and permanent beneath her palm. She stood there for a little while longer. Then she turned and went back to the warmth of the hall and the music, and the people she was learning to trust. That's the end of today's story. But before we go, what are the key words we learned today? Let's review the 10 most useful words from this story. 1. Disguise, to change your appearance so others do not recognize you. 2. Cautious, careful to avoid danger or mistakes. 3. Innocent, without guilt, not knowing about danger or bad things. 4. Poison, a substance that harms or kills when taken into the body. 5. Invisible, impossible to see. 6. Permanent, lasting forever, not changing. 7. Triumphant, feeling great happiness after a victory. 8. Justice, fair punishment or reward for actions. 9. Coffin, a box in which a dead person is placed for burial. 10. Witness, a person who sees an event happen. Thank you for listening to the Slow Storyteller. Slow stories, real English every week. If today's story helped you, please subscribe so you don't miss next week's. Until then, keep listening, keep learning,